Hi, I'm Richard England, and welcome to Alpha at Home. Just in case you're not quite sure what you've joined in with, Alpha is one of the best introductions to Christianity that there is. It's been running for over 20 years. It runs globally. Nearly 30 million people around the world have done Alpha. And in Crofton Parish, we were one of the very first parishes in the country to get involved with Alpha when it launched over 20 years ago. We think that Alpha is one of the best ways to get to grips with the ideas and the person at the heart of Christianity. Normally on Alpha, there'd be some food, and then there'd be a presentation followed by some group time, where there'd be an opportunity to discuss and process what you've just heard. But during this very strange time in which we're living, during quarantine and lockdown, we're doing Alpha at home. The benefits are you can sit in your home with a cup of tea and relax and join in, but you still get the opportunity to share in the Alpha experience. Now we're going to just be doing the first half of the Alpha course. Normally the Alpha course is about 10 to 12 weeks long. We're going to be doing just the first 5 weeks, which look at the big ideas at the heart of Christianity. And there'll be each Thursday morning we'll release a new video. These have been pre-recorded with that week's presentation on it. And then you have the opportunity to have a discussion, have group time as it were, in a slightly different way. If you have a comment or a question you'd like to ask, you can put it in the comments on Facebook under the video, or if you that can seem a little bit public. So if you'd like to do it in a slightly more confidential way, then you can send your question or your comment in the following days to alpha@croftonparish.org.uk. And then the following week, I'll spend the first 20 minutes of the session just feeding back some of the comments, maybe thinking about some of the questions that have been asked that have come from the previous session. So there'll still be some group time, there'll still be some discussion time, but it will be at the beginning of the following week rather than immediately after the session. I really hope you find this experience of sharing Alpha together at home like this to be something that is rewarding and enriching. Let's get into it, shall we, with the first Alpha session. It may be that this very strange time in which we're living has caused you to take a step back from the busyness of your everyday life and wrestle with and begin to consider some of the bigger questions in life. Well, Alpha begins at the very beginning with the question that really takes us into every other question. Is there more to life than this? Now, you probably realise this, but we, at this moment in the West, in the early 21st century, have been raised to be suspicious of anything that we can't see and touch and feel. We are raised within what's called a naturalistic or a materialist worldview, where we are certain of things that we can see and touch and feel, but we are skeptical, we are suspicious of anything beyond the natural, material, physical world. It might be all right for somebody else to have a faith, to have a set of beliefs about what's out there, and that's fine for you, but me, I'm not so sure. And lots of people have lots of different, believe lots of different things. So how could any of us know for sure? We can't know those things, we think anyway, in the same way that you can know that this table is really here, that this mug is really here. And so that's why we begin really at the very beginning, which is a very good place to start, with the question, is there more to life than this? And what I want to do with you today is to build a bridge to the idea of God. And as we build this bridge, the bridge has got 5 spans, as it were, each of which is a question. I want to ask you reasonably briefly 5 questions, the answers to which I think offer evidence that there is more to life than what we can see and touch and feel. That, as it were, our flattened worldview within which we live, which has excluded anything spiritual or anything supernatural, simply doesn't tell the whole story of what is going on in the world around us. So let's get into it, shall we? 5 questions to help us build a bridge to the idea of God. Why is there something rather than nothing? For many years, this was not really a question, because the scientific consensus surrounding the nature of the universe was that we existed within what's called a steady state universe. The idea that the universe is basically infinite. It has no beginning and no end. It's just always been there. But as you will probably know, through the first half of the 20th century, that scientific consensus started to come undone. And it came undone for 2 particular reasons. The first was that as we got better at astronomy and cosmology, as we began to look out to the stars and the galaxies, the people measuring what they saw out there realized to their shock that the gaps between galaxies and stars and planets were getting larger, and they realized that the universe was expanding. Like a balloon, it was expanding in every direction. And obviously, if it was expanding, if it was going outwards, then that must mean it would be possible to trace the universe back to a moment of origin, to a place of beginning. And this was confirmed when we get into about the 1960s, when, again, as we looked out into the universe, all the measurements, all the experiments that were done, they seemed to be plagued by some kind of static, a kind of radioactive interference that seemed to be everywhere we listened, everywhere we looked out in the universe. And to begin with, the assumption was that it was an instrument failure, it was a problem at our end, but as they made all the adjustments, they began to realize it wasn't a problem with our instruments, wasn't a problem with our measurements. There was a background noise, a background radiation that existed in the universe wherever you looked. And in the 1960s, the scientist Fred Hoyle described this as the after effects of the moment of origin, the moment of beginning. He coined the term the Big Bang, because we can still hear the after effects of that moment in the universe today. And that presents a universe with a beginning, presents a profound set of questions. Because we know that, as you will know from the song, nothing comes from nothing, because nothing ever could. We know that everything within the universe exists under the principle of, under the law of cause and effect. If I stub my toe, the effect of me stubbing my toe was due to the cause of me not paying attention where I was going and walking into the door frame. Everything we see around us, we experience, exists under the law of cause and effect. The whole universe can be imagined as a great chain of cause and effect, but we get back to the very beginning and we have an effect, the birth of the universe, but we don't have a cause. So why is there something rather than nothing? Well, really, there are only 2 possible answers to that question. And there are lots of different ways of phrasing those answers, but there are only 2 possible answers. The first answer is that, well, it just happened. Lucky us. Somehow out of nothing, a universe started. Aren't we lucky? Isn't that absolutely wonderful? We just lucked out. Isn't that great? There's no plan, there's no design, there's no purpose. It's just pure blind luck. It just happened by chance. Now, for me, that's a big pill to swallow. A whole universe coming into being just by chance. That is a big pill to swallow, but maybe that's what you think. If you don't think that, the only other option is that it didn't happen by chance. It didn't happen by accident, which means it happened by design, by intention. For the last 1,000 years, the theologians have described God as being the first cause within the great chain of cause and effect. Sometimes he's described as the prime mover, the unmoved mover, the one who is not affected by the physical universe but yet can set things into motion. The idea of a being who is not part of the material universe and yet can interact with the material universe in such a way as to get the whole thing going. And anyone like that existed and was powerful and intentional enough to get the whole universe going, we would probably call God. So here's the first question for us to think about as we build a bridge to the idea of God. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe work so well? You probably may never think about this question, but once you start to think about it, you begin to realize that we depend on life kind of working really well. I think that's shown in stark relief to us at the moment because so many of the things that we assumed would be normal about our everyday lives have been thrown up into the air. Actually, we're living through a time which is very abnormal and very unusual, and it shows us how many of the ordinary things of our lives, like seeing our family and friends, going to work in the morning, being able to go to Costa and have a skinny caramel latte, how many of those kinds of things we take for granted. We only realize when they're taken away. But beneath those things like that, which happen within our normal day, there are a whole set of laws and principles by which the universe works. If you think about it, our lives would be very different if gravity turned off every other Wednesday afternoon. We rely on the fact that the sun will rise in the morning, that the constants of the universe are constant, and that the universe works well. It works really, really well. It works really well all the way down to the very kind of atomic, subatomic level. There are principles and laws at work. There is maths going on there that you and I will probably never understand. So here's our second question. Why does the universe work so well? And again, there are only two possible answers to this question. And actually, they're the same answers as the first question. The first possible answer is, well, lucky us. Not only do we have a universe that seems to have created itself, it just happens to be that that universe works really well. It works well enough to sustain itself and not collapse in under its own weight. And it works well enough to be a place in which eventually, over time, life could emerge. People like us could come to be in a universe like this. But people like us could only come to be in a universe that works really well. The problem with that being just an accident, that being just happening by chance, is that the likelihood, the probability of that is infinitesimally small. I mean, it is absolutely tiny. If you think back through all the constants, all the things that had to be just right for the universe to work as well as it does, it is almost impossible. The probability is so small. Fred Hoyle, who named the beginning of the universe the Big Bang, he used a picture analogy. He said it would be like a hurricane, a whirlwind blowing through a warehouse and leaving behind it a fully formed, perfectly built fighter jet. That's the chances of it. It would be like you and I winning the lottery, having our numbers come up every day for the rest of our lives, and that wouldn't even get us close. The probability, the likelihood of a universe like ours coming into existence by itself is so small that you have to say, I would have to say to you, I think that is almost as big a step of faith as any other. Well, it just happened by itself. Lucky us. Who'd have thought it? Well, that's one answer, but the other answer is that it didn't come into being by itself. That it looks designed because it is designed. It looks ordered because it is ordered. If I walked into, when they were a bit younger, one of my kids' bedrooms and found a set of Lego on the floor where the bricks had been built into a wonderful model, into a house or into some other playset, I wouldn't walk in and say, well, isn't it amazing how these Lego bricks put themselves together like this? I would know that behind that ordered, designed creation was an ordered and designed creator. Not to say that God is constantly pulling the strings, but that from the very moment of creation, the universe is created in such a way that it can be self-sustaining. Right back to those very moments with those strange particles, things like Higgs boson particles, all of those strange things that contribute towards the universe being the way it is, all happen because it's not just random, it's not just chance. Talking of Higgs boson particles, would you like a joke? Okay, this is a very niche joke for those of you who know a little bit about church and are also physicists. A Higgs boson, this is obviously not a joke for this time because it's about a Higgs boson particle walking into church. The Higgs boson particle walks into church and the priest comes up to him and says, you can't come in here. The Higgs boson particle looks at the priest and says, but without me, how can you have mass? I thank you. John Polkinghorne, who has got two titles on here, one of which he shares with me, one of which he doesn't. So John Polkinghorne, who is both an Anglican priest and theoretical physicist, I am one of those things, but not the other. He says this: the fine-tuning, the idea that the universe has been ordered, has been finely tuned to work as well as it does. Fine-tuning is too remarkable to be dismissed as just a happy accident. Well, you might say to yourself, okay, Richard, that's all very well, but you're just a parish vicar. Could we talk to somebody that knows a little more about these things? Well, let me introduce you to Francis Collins. Francis Collins is an American scientist. He was the head of the Human Genome Project back in the 90s, the American government project that first mapped the human genome. He is an extremely smart person. If you'd like to hear his take on coronavirus, you can search that up on YouTube as well. But why don't we see what he has to say about all of these things? Take a few minutes to listen to Francis Collins.
Well, in the home where I grew up, faith was not something that was talked about very much. My father was a professor of drama, my mother a playwright. When I went to college and those discussions in the dorm late at night about religion began to occur, I had no particular reason to attach value to a faith system. It had never been something I was familiar with or had internalized at all. And I assumed that any religious feelings that anyone held must be on the basis of some emotional experience, and I didn't trust those, or on the basis of some childhood indoctrination, which I felt I was fortunate to have missed. I loved the experience of learning about the human body and all of the components of that, and I particularly loved being introduced to genetics. But then I ended up in the medical school curriculum sitting at the bedside of patients with diseases. This was no longer an abstract study of molecules and organ systems. These were real people. And one afternoon, one of my patients, a wonderful elderly woman, much like a grandmother, who had very bad heart disease. She had a particularly bad episode of chest pain while I was with her. She got through it, and at the end of that, explained to me how her faith was the thing that helped her in that situation. She realized that The doctors around her weren't really giving her that much help, but her faith was. And after she finished her own very personal description of that faith, she turned to me, and I had been silent, and she looked at me quizzically, and she said, "What do you believe, doctor?" And ultimately, I had to admit to myself that her question had made me realize that I had arrived at an answer to the most important issue that we humans ever deal with. Is there a God? And I had arrived there without ever really looking at the evidence. And I was supposed to be a scientist. If there's one thing scientists claim they do, is to arrive at conclusions based upon evidence. And I hadn't taken the trouble to do that. I was greatly assisted by a pastor who lived down the road, who I went and asked about all this, and who gave me a copy of C.S. Lewis's wonderful book, Mere Christianity. Because here was an Oxford scholar, a prodigiously developed intellect, who had traveled the same path. Within those pages, I realized for the first time that one can come to belief on a rational basis, and that in fact, given the many pointers that one sees around oneself in terms of the universe and it having a beginning, and its fine-tuning in terms of the way in which all those constants that determine the behavior of matter and energy seem to have been set just in a certain very precise range to make life possible, and many other things, including my beloved mathematics and why they actually work anyway to describe the universe, something that makes you think the Creator must have been a mathematician. That brought me then to the person of Jesus Christ as a person who was historically extremely well documented. That was news to me. I thought Christ was as much myth as history, and I realized after reading more about it, this was a historical figure upon which we have a great deal of evidence for his existence and his teachings, and even his rising from the dead in a literal way. That day at my patient's bedside started a journey for me, a journey that I was reluctant to begin, but I felt I needed to, a journey that I thought would result in strengthening my atheism, but to my surprise, resulted in my conversion.
Where does our sense of good and evil come from? I don't know if you've ever thought about that. The ideas of good and evil are universals in human culture. Every single human culture that has ever existed has an idea of good, has the idea of good and evil. It is somehow innate to what it means to be human. Now, cultures disagree, sometimes violently, on what exactly constitutes good and what exactly constitutes evil. But every single human culture, every single human person actually has an idea of good and evil. Even somebody that someone else might consider to be not a very good person still has their own sense of morality. We have some friends who many years ago moved onto a poor estate in Manchester to help plant a new Christian community there. They had warned they had been warned that it would be tough, and sure enough, just after a couple of days of moving in, they got burgled. They'd been told to expect this, but still they were pretty distraught about it. Nevertheless, they kept going with their commitment to love this impoverished estate community. And over the years, they got to know many of their neighbours. They became part of those streets, part of those communities. And eventually, they started to figure out. They reckon they worked out who it was that had broken into their house on those first couple of days after they'd moved in. About 6 or 7 years later, this young man was sent to prison. And because they had got to know him and they got to know the community, the wife of this couple went to go and visit him in prison. And he was obviously very moved by her kindness towards him. And they had a little bit of time talking. And after some time talking in the prison, he said to her, "Can I tell you something?" She said, "Yeah." He said, "It was me that broke into your house when you first moved in. You know, when you got burgled, it was me that broke in." She said, "Oh," pretending that she hadn't already figured it out. But then he said, "But I've still got my morals. I didn't look in your knicker drawer. You see, someone that you might consider to be on the wrong side of what would be generally considered to be the moral compass still has his own sense of right and wrong. But where does our sense of right and wrong come from? And why is it that we're so drawn to good and so repelled by evil? We've seen an amazing example of good in the last couple of weeks. Captain Tom Moore, who decided that to try to raise money for the NHS, he would do 100 laps of his garden in the weeks leading up to his 100th birthday. So this 99-year-old set out hoping to raise £1,000. As you know, by the time he got to his 100th birthday, he'd raised over £20 million. Why? Well, we might understand why he would do that. But why is it that so many of us are drawn to acts of goodness and generosity like this? Well, it gives us a way to cope. It gives us a way to help, to kind of try to manage the challenge of the times we're in. But where does that sense of good and evil come from? C.S. Lewis puts it like this. He says, if you wanted to look for God, you couldn't look, because God is not part of the physical universe, you couldn't look for God within the physical universe in exactly the same way that you couldn't find the architect of a house by looking in the chimney. Instead, you might try to find God within the inner world. The longings towards good, the longings away, the repulsion towards evil that we find within the creatures within that world. In short, C.S. Lewis's argument is that our very sense of right and wrong, our sense of good and evil, is actually God trying to get our attention. So there's question number 3. Where does our sense of good and evil come from? We're nearly there, just a couple more questions to go. Here's the 4th one. Why do so many people believe? It's very easy to think, growing up in the UK in the early 21st century, that people who have some kind of faith, people who practice a religion, are in the minority. The philosopher Charles Taylor puts it this way. He says, in the UK in the year 1500, it was basically impossible not to believe in God because everybody did. But in the UK in the year 2000, it's almost impossible to believe in God because so few people do. And so we grow up in this world seeming to think that that faith, that religious belief is somehow on the way out. But we miss the fact that in Europe, in the West, we are still, both in terms of geography, global geography as the world is today, and in terms of human history, we are still massively in the minority. Nearly over 84% of the world's population have some kind of faith. And actually between now and 2050, that number is only going to go up. It's going to go up to over 90% of the world's population, particularly because of what's been happening in China. China, which was one of the great atheist states of the 20th century, Christianity has been growing there at a rate of 10% since 1979. And that change in China alone is going to increase on a global scale the proportion of the human population that practice some kind of faith, that believe in something beyond the natural, beyond the physical, beyond the material. Why do so many people believe? Why does it almost seem to be a universal? And that's particularly challenging when you think about the language that often gets used to describe religious faith. One of the most famous books on this of the last 20 years is by Richard Dawkins, who we'll return to again in a minute. And his book was entitled The God Delusion. Not the God mistake, or the God error, or the God kind of maybe, maybe not. No, the language was much stronger than that. The idea that belief in God is a delusion. Now, he's very welcome to have his opinion, of course he is. The problem is this, is that people who are deluded cannot function within society. People who are deluded, people who believe in something completely, profoundly irrational, find it very difficult to raise a family, to hold down a job, to be constructive, contributive members of society. And yet over 84% of the world's population would say they believe in something beyond the material. It's difficult to say that, it's difficult to hold on to the idea that 84% of the world's population are deluded, are actually fundamentally irrational, because most of us seem to be able to get on okay with our lives. I think the opposite answer is true. Not that faith is in somehow unnatural. I think the opposite answer is true, that actually faith is something fundamental to what it means to be human. That we are wired, as it were, to ask these questions. Because to be human is to look beyond what we can see and touch and feel. And to reach out for that which is beyond us, only to discover that that which is beyond us has been reaching out for us. Why do so many people believe? For me, the other questions that we've asked are really important questions. They're really compelling questions, but they weren't the questions that got me on a journey towards Christian faith. It was this question that did that. And actually, we're not going to particularly answer it today because it's going to be the topic of our next couple of weeks. The question is simply, who is Jesus? What does the story of this person, Jesus of Nazareth, tell us, not just about ourselves, but about reality and about whether there's a God or not? Who is this person who walked into human history, not just another religious teacher, another prophet to tell us how to get to God, but someone who claimed to be God himself? What an outrageous claim. Either he must have been a terrible person, a liar, a fraud, a huckster, trying to fool everybody for some strange purpose of his own, or he was a madman, or maybe he was telling the truth. And actually his life, his death, and his resurrection tell us something not just about himself, but tell us something fundamental about the reality within which we live, and the reality of God. But to answer that question more deeply, you're going to have to come back next week. So we've had our 5 questions, but here's a 6th question that people often ask me. Why isn't it more obvious? All right, Richard, here's all this evidence that you've shown us that might get us to the point of thinking that there could possibly be a God. But why doesn't he make it more obvious? Why doesn't he make it clearer? Why doesn't he make it easier for us to see him, to experience him? Why doesn't he just show himself to everybody? That is a great question. And to help us answer it, we probably need to find somebody who is a little bit smarter than I am. So let me introduce you to Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal lived in France in the 17th century. He studied mathematics and logic. He also was instrumental in designing the very first tram lines in Paris. He also, as a young man, became a very committed Christian and wrote extensively on theology as well as maths and logic. He died when he was young. He was younger than I am when he died, but he left behind him a remarkable body of work. And one of the questions he gave himself to was exactly this question. Why doesn't God make it more obvious? And the way that Blaise Pascal answered it was like this. He said, it's almost as if God offers just enough evidence so that for the person who wants to see, it is blindingly obvious. But he only offers just enough evidence so that for the person who doesn't want to believe, it seems self-evident to say, of course, there could never be a God. There is nothing more than what we can see and touch and feel. Blaise Pascal put it this way. He said, it's almost as if God regulates the revelation of himself, so that if you want to see, you can, but if you don't have to. This is his quote. There is enough light for those who desire only to see, and enough obscurity for those who have a contrary disposition. Blaise Pascal would turn the question back on us and say, actually, it comes down to whether you want to see or not. It's almost as if God hides because he wants to know who will seek him. So two different people can look at the same evidence, the questions that I've asked us today, and they can come to entirely different conclusions. Let's go back to Richard Dawkins again. Richard Dawkins, looking at exactly the same evidence that we've just talked about today, comes to a very different conclusion. He says this: the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Whereas another Richard, who will never get quoted as widely as Richard Dawkins, that's me, Richard England, says this: the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the heart of it the loving intention of a creator. Why do I say that? Well, you see, if there's a creator, then you'd expect the universe to have a beginning, and it does. If there is a loving creator who has ordered the universe, ordered reality for the benefit of those that live within it, you would expect the universe to be finely tuned to work really well, and it does. If there's a good, loving creator who within that universe has provided the opportunity for beings to emerge within it that can look beyond themselves, that can look out back towards their creator, you would expect those beings to in some way reflect the character of their creator, who is good and not evil, by knowing the difference between good and evil. And they do, even if we don't do good as much as we might like, and sometimes we're drawn to evil more than we might want to admit. And if there really is a creator at the heart of it all, who has created a universe within which beings like us might emerge, you would expect that the almost the default nature of those beings would be to look beyond themselves, to reach out for their creator. And even if they order their understanding of what that creator is like in all sorts of different ways, still they would be innately spiritual. It would be fundamental to be human to believe. And guess what? So many people believe. And if there were a good, loving creator who did all of this, you might even imagine that at one point in human history, that creator would himself intervene. The author would write himself into the story and enter the stage of human history, because his great desire is that he might be known by us as we are known by him. So what you find is the bridge that we've been building to the idea of God turns out to be the bridge that God has built towards us. Thank you so much for being part of our first Alpha at Home session. I hope you found it informative and maybe even intriguing enough for you to come back next week. And if you'd like to leave a comment or a question, you can do that in the comments section on Facebook. But if you would prefer to share something more personal or more confidential, if you email alpha@croftonparish.org.uk with your question or with your comment, we will spend some time next week. The first 20 minutes or so of our session next week will be doing some feedback on your questions and your comments. Thanks again for being involved today. Really looking forward to picking up the story next week in the second session of Alpha at Home, when we dig a little deeper into the question, who is Jesus?